The following podcast contains explicit language.
I'm Stephen Metcalf, and this is the Slate Culture Gabfest Naked Doorway Edition. This is also the daily podcast from Slate.com for Wednesday, April 28th, 2010. On today's program, the performance artist Marina Abramovic, the 201st episode of South Park, Censored, and HBO presents Al Pacino as Jack Kevorkian. Joining me today are Slate's deputy editor, Julia Turner. Hello, Julia.
Hi, Steve.
And our film critic, Dana Stevens. Hey, Dana.
Hey, Steve.
And also joining us today is Lisa Tharpe.
Hello, Steve.
Lisa, would you say that it was fortuitous or serendipitous that we ran into you yesterday at the Marina Abramovic exhibit, or both?
Both fortuitous and serendipitous.
I agree with you on that. I know you mostly as Dana Stevens' friend, but you're more than just that. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am also the author of P is for Please, a Bestiary of Manners. So, if you don't mind your P's and Q's, be careful.
The animals will get you?
Or I will.
And I'm just going to throw in, because Lisa's being too modest, that it's a wonderful children's book that she wrote and our friend Ali Barampour illustrated.
And Dana's fabulous husband was the art director, designer.
Fantastic. And the reason you join us today is we ran into you fortuitously and serendipitously at this exhibit at the MOMA at the Museum of Modern Art yesterday. As a quick backgrounder on it, this was the first time, Dana told me, and I trust her, that it was the first time that MoMA had engaged with performance art. They did it in a big way. They brought in, I think it's fair to say, a legend in the medium, a woman named Marina Abramovic, who was born in Yugoslavia. Her became prominent in the 1970s behind the Iron Curtain. As the exhibit notes say, her body is object, subject, and medium of her work all at once. We went and saw the exhibit yesterday. Dana, it's become notorious for one specific part of it. Why don't we describe that, and then we'll branch out.
Yeah, this was sort of the peg that made us decide to do it, although there's so much more to talk about with this exhibit. I can't wait to start a conversation about it. But yeah, I guess it's the presence of nude bodies in the exhibit that's been the subject of controversy and attention and drawn a lot of people to the show, and definitely charges the atmosphere at the show in a way that, most trips to MoMA aren't charged. So it's not just the nude doorway standards that have gotten so much coverage, which is that when you walk into the exhibit, you have one room of videos of taped performances of Abramovic from the 70s and 80s, and then to get into the next room with all the rest of the exhibit, you don't have to, but you may pass through a narrow doorway that's sort of stood in by these two naked threshold standards that are quite close together, and so to get past you have to squeeze through and basically brush against naked strangers.
Yeah, so two naked strangers standing facing one another, no more than, 18 inches apart from one another?
Less than that.
Probably even
less than a human body width apart. I mean, you'd have to be a really skinny person to not touch them going in between them. And it's also, I think, important to point out something that I didn't realize in all the buzz and press coverage about these people getting groped and so forth, is that this is a recreation, a re-performance of something that Abramovic herself and her... Well, we'll have to get into who this is later,
partner.
But this guy, Ulay, who was her lover and companion and collaborator for 10 years or so, that back in the 70s when they originally did this exhibit or this performance, it was the two of them standing, which to me gives it a completely different feeling, right? I mean, for it to be these people who created the exhibit, it's their idea, it's their work, and they're also, as everyone knows, this kind of famous artistic couple. It's just a very different feeling to walk through that threshold than to walk through a threshold of these two strangers to each other, strangers to us, essentially hired naked models.
Well, originally you couldn't get into the exhibit at all.
Right, it was the only choice.
You walked through them.
So it's actually quite different from the original performance, and it was something that I found really alienating, the presence of these naked guys. How did you guys feel
we should
about
describe it. It was very funny. We all trundled up there yesterday, and the room before the naked doorway is this room of anxiety in which everyone's sort of watching the Abramovic videos, and they are compelling and interesting, but mostly everybody's making the decision, am I going to go through the naked doorway or am I going to go through the regular doorway, and then also kind of ginning up the nerve to squeeze through. You sort of milled around by the doorway and watched as a little old lady kind of steal her shoulder like a football linebacker and just kind of edge her way through, and then the men's members were just kind of swaying in the breeze after she went by, and you're just like, I can't believe I might be about to do that.
Wait, back up. Two members?
Yeah, they're
two swaying members?
Yeah, they're both. She sort of squeezed through. They're two.
Wait, you're telling me that those were both men?
Yes.
No.
Yes.
I saw the guy facing me was all man. But the one with her back was a woman, right? This like teardrop buttocks.
No, it was a delicately shaped,
No, that
lovely
was
young
that
man.
was sort of like
No.
a David Bowie-esque, the calipigeon rump on that one, but there was a member on the front.
No kidding. Oh my
See,
God.
I think Steve was just made so anxious by the presence of the nakeds that he couldn't even check them out enough to ascertain their sex.
If you had squeezed through, Steve, you would have.
there would have been no mistaking
There definitely
anybody's gender.
And okay, so yeah, you're afraid of the Swain members, but so let's say there were two nubile young ladies. Would it have been different?
First of all, this segment was not labeled Steve's homosexual panic. Okay, it was about art and the Iron Curtain and freedom and decadence and conscience. It had nothing to do with my relationship to penises. I wouldn't have squeezed I do not interact with performance art. No way, no day. Period. End of story. I don't care if it's Christy Turlington or whoever.
I like that Christy Turlington is your supermodel, by the way. Although we should note that the nakeds in the museum prefer to be called performers and not models. But I think we should just call them the nakeds because I think that's better. That's more evocative.
At any rate, Julia and I did the squeeze through because we felt like somebody had to take it on the chin for the Gabfest. How was your squeeze, Julia?
Oh my God.
Well, my squeeze was very. I think I took it more like on the close sides of my
not
hips.
the chin.
I felt like it was like pulling off a Band-Aid. Like I was surprised by how unnerved I was at the prospect and by how close together they were. And then I kind of just gritted my teeth and tensed all my muscles and like kind of went through. And then the woman after me sort of limberly went through and did kind of like a low warrior two kind of squat between the guys, and then she paused and kind of stared one of the guys, the less effeminate guy, in the eyes and had like a moment between
I wish
them.
I'd seen
and
that.
then she kind of like limberly rose back up into the room, and then I felt like I'd done it in the most square way possible. Like I'd been like, I'm not a person, you're not a person, this is just a doorway, oh God, And then I saw actually Jessie, our producer, also went through. We should give her props, and I think she actually managed to squeeze through without touching either of the dudes. And then Dana,
She's shaking her head in the control.
Touch something.
I'm sorry,
But you didn't take it on the chin.
And then Dana, I got to see your face as you came through, and you kind of.
I was going to say, I think somebody was more square than you. I'm sure that my face just looked like, was it just complete mortification? I almost stepped on one of the guy's feet, too.
You,
I mean,
like,
nobody
tripped or
talks about that part. You can't help but step on their foot a little bit, too. It's sort of natural to say, excuse me, but yet you can't bring yourself to talk to them.
But I have to jump in here and say that we are reenacting my very problem with this part of the exhibit, which is it kind of begins to dominate your consciousness of the experience of being there. It certainly dominated the publicity surrounding it, whereas it's a tiny, tiny, tiny part of what's installed right now at MoMA. And it seems to me one of the less interesting or thought-provoking parts of the exhibit.
I think it does serve a really key function in the exhibit, though. I mean, so one thing that's remarkable about this exhibit is that it's a retrospective of performance art, which in and of itself has an inherent contradiction. Most of these works, including one, there was a famous work that she did, I think in the 1970s, where she sat in a gallery space and had a table before her that was arrayed with knives, scissors, lipstick, honey, all kinds of different, and famously a gun and a single bullet. And the performance was that she invited the audience to do anything they wanted to her with any of those objects. And
For 6 hours.
For 6 hours. And she sort of said in her introduction to it or something, I've not done this because I want to die. I don't want to die. I just want to see how much I can take. And so people, sort of steeled up their nerve and started doing silly things to her, and eventually did more and more violent things to her. And eventually someone loaded the gun and put it in her hand and put it to her face or neck or something. And, obviously that was as far as it went. But,
That's not really, as far as it went. There was, depending on who you talk to, there was a riot to keep the person from those who wanted it to go as far as it could go, and the other people who didn't want her to see her hurt.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think there started to be factions in the audience.
So
Right.
it's not just. Sorry,
But when you think
messed that up.
when you think of something as charged as a room like that, and then you think of kind of the august sort of funny space of the Museum of Modern Art, which is where everything that is transgressive and surprising about modern art goes to be kind of enshrined and ennobled and codified.
Entombed.
Exactly, entombed. I think that the Naked Doorway, which feels a bit sillier and lighter, I think, than that particular performance, still gives you the moment of like, okay, this is what it might have been like to be at one of these original. Steve, I'm interested to hear you say that you don't engage with performance art. I mean, I don't engage with performance art either, typically. I'm one of those people who hates even the like theater production where in the front row you might be asked to somehow be part of it, or it always feels silly. And what struck me about this exhibit and learning more about Abramovic's work is that this kind of performance art performed behind the Iron Curtain in a space of real political oppression felt like it had so much more merit to me. Felt like it made sense. It felt like playing with boundaries and playing with rules and forcing your oppressed spectators to engage with that kind of boundary and rule breaking made sense in a way that if you're to go to a gallery in sort of decadent aughts New York and somebody's doing something ridiculous and asking you to participate, you just feel silly.
Yeah, Julia, you totally stole my thunder. This was the one thing I took away from this, which is that how both deeply courageous and deeply subversive it must have been to perform these works in Belgrade back in the 1970s, when you are doing them in the face of diktat's power to appropriate and command your body, and through commanding your body, command your mind, and you're conceptualizing art that's going to reverse that flow, that totalitarian flow. Absolutely necessary, completely courageous. When performance art takes place in the West, it strikes me it flirts with decadence in a way that it never could when it was behind the Iron Curtain. And we should say that quite a lot of her career really was only the first quarter to third of her career that was behind the Iron Curtain. She very soon moved to Western Europe, gained prominence in the West. Nothing about her work strikes me as especially decadent. I think it retains its authority from having once been, a fuck you to authoritarianism. But it reminds me of so much work that it comes in its wake that is really, to my mind, very mindlessly titillating in some ways.
But this is a price that you pay when you're a pioneer in your field, right? I mean, it seems pretty clear to me, even though I would say our Tori Patterson, our own critic at Slate, wrote a little post on this, which we'll link to on the show page, but the way he put it was, she has a very impressive record for a performance artist, which is that only 25% of her work is bullshit, and that's a little bit how I felt about this show. And honestly, the nude door standers, at least in that iteration, I can see how back in 77, when it was Marina and Ule, that had, some real gravitas to it, but I felt that was kind of one of the bullshit portions. I thought that the room that you got into after you squeezed through the nude people was the high point of the exhibit, which was the work that she did with Ule in that decade that they were together, which in many great ways was, it just seemed like the cornerstone of performance art that has been, diluted in so many iterations since then. I really particularly loved that piece where the two of them stood together. She and Ule stood facing each other with a bow and arrow. And it's sort of hard to describe it, but you can find clips of this on YouTube. I was going to mention that if you don't live in New York and haven't seen this show, you can find a lot of the original performances, not recreated, but the ones back in the 70s and 80s on YouTube. And in this piece, I can't remember what it was called now, that they held this bow and arrow in perfect suspension against her heart. So it was sort of a piece about masochism and the possibility of death, but also kind of about harmony and balance. It was just a really beautiful image, I thought.
I want to skip about 30 years to now. And as you were saying that at the time those works were really powerful, I think that the artist is present, that where she's sitting at a table and she invites members of the museum to come in, is really powerful for now, and it speaks to so many ills and what's going on in our culture now, that it's rebellious and almost revolutionary.
Let's set it up just a little bit. That Marina Abramovic is doing a live performance as part of the installation. She sits in the middle of MoMA's gigantic atrium in a square space that's empty of everything except for Marina Abramovic herself sitting at a desk, and she's wearing, how would you describe it? It's like a long but not
incredible flowing red robe. It looks like a costume from a science fiction film or something.
Right.
It's like a glamorous blanket.
A glamorous what?
Blanket.
Slanket.
Oh, I was thinking, yeah, blanket.
And museum visitors are free to go and sit across from her for however long she decides.
No, you decide.
You decide.
They decide.
Okay.
And we should say we part of why we wanted you to come on the show, Lisa, is because you waited for how long yesterday?
About 5 hours.
For about 5 hours yesterday, and you did the sitting, and you got to sit there. So I wanted to know what that was like.
I'm going to backtrack a little. It was my second time sitting with her.
Oh, wow.
I also sat with her on Friday. And the first time I sat with her was really a surprisingly meditative experience, considering that you're sitting in a giant atrium in a museum with three video cameras on you doing a live feed, plus a photographer, plus hundreds of visitors watching you. I felt like I was in a river floating down the river. Like I was just sort of part of some... And I'm not like that at all, like some flowy goodness. Uh-huh. And that's so not my personality, to be part of flowy goodness. And I completely lost track of time.
Do you know how long you were there for?
I do know. I sat for 29 minutes, and I would have guessed I sat for somewhere between 5 and 10.
Wow.
But yesterday, my first time in line, you wait for hours, and there are lots of people, and there were quite a few people who had sat with her before, and they all said that I should go back and do it again because the second time is just a completely different experience. So I had time yesterday, and I thought, okay, I'm going to do this. So I sat again for 5 hours, got up, did my turn, and it was not the same. I was completely aware of all the people. I was aware of the camera. I was aware of the videos, and I had a really hard time focusing and just being present, whereas the first time it was some sort of slightly magical, mystical experience.
So here's a question. Do you think that had anything to do with the way that Marina Abramovic sits and stares, or was it the simple fact of the artificiality of looking at someone in silence across a table in a museum?
I think what is interesting about the piece is that you are asked to just be and do nothing, and you don't get any response or any reciprocation for whatever smile or smirk or look you have. She stays pretty placid. And so you get to imagine whatever she might be thinking of you or thinking of what she had for breakfast. And it's just not very often that you look at somebody and that you just look. You don't talk to them. You don't do anything with them. You just look at them. Mm. And to hold a gaze for more than 5 seconds doesn't happen. I mean, I'm trying to do that with you, Dana, right now. And it's hard to
I'm not feeling the flowy goodness.
Dana, you found something on the web that was very interesting. Many people break down crying after a certain amount of time with Maria Abramovic.
That's right. Yeah. We found a line that there was a Tumblr post of, this because there's a camera on at all times of, 10 or so faces of people who started to cry while looking at her, which I can imagine if it's kind of a meditative experience and you've got whatever place you're going to in your mind that could happen. Did you feel any emotional waves like that?
So, no, but as I said, I'm not super touchy-feely. But yesterday in line, I decided I was going to interview everyone in line with me and ask them why they were there and if they'd done it a second time or a third, in one case 16 times.
Wow.
Why and what the experience was. And everyone who had already done it described it as a meditative experience. And the people who were super yoga guru-y types described it as as jumping ahead in their practice. Normally they would have to sit for huge length of times, and within a minute or two of sitting with her, it was like they had done their practice all morning. Mm. So there was definitely a transcendental quality. And I don't know if it's her or what people bring to the session. I don't know.
Okay, we could talk about this all day, but I guess we should wrap and get on to the next. But I wanted to point out a few places that if you can't make it to the show, you can substitute some pretty good equivalents. One of them is Judith Thurman's profile of Abramovich in The New Yorker. I'm not sure when it appeared, a couple months ago when the show opened, maybe 1 month ago. But it's a wonderful, wonderful profile and really great to read if you're going to the exhibit as well. She also has a slideshow on the New Yorker website about Abramovich.
And there's also a live feed where you can, during the museum hours, you can watch whoever comes and sits with Marina. And also on that same site, portraits of every person who sat with her.
Oh, fantastic.
Which I think is almost more interesting than the live feed.
Lisa, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your experience with us.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.
It was such a treat.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa.
Dana, this is the rare Gabfest where all three topics are actually united thematically with one another. This is building on our Marina Abramovic discussion. These are the wages of freedom of conscience and freedom of speech in a supposedly free liberal democracy. South Park has done nothing if not offended people and, trod the boundaries separating comedy from outright blasphemy. And to celebrate their 200th and then their 201st episode, they took it quite far beyond the tolerance of their corporate parent in some ways, Comedy Central, owned by Viacom. Why don't you walk us a little bit through what's going on here?
Well, I guess the offensive episode of South Park, if I understand, I have seen, but with censoring, the offensive episode of South Park, and nobody at this point can see it without the censoring. I think
the censored version is not available
and
anymore.
never aired in the first place. So what happens in the episode, I mean, the plot is sort of too absurdly South Parkian to get into, but essentially the South Park boys, the main foursome, and some group of bad guys called the Gingers are fighting over the body of Mohammed the Prophet. I mean, the living person of Mohammed the Prophet, and each of them is trying to keep him ransom for various reasons, and Tom Cruise ends up figuring into the scene. But what was offensive to Muslims about the show is simply the fact that the name of Mohammed is said over and over, and the image of Mohammed is shown in some way. At one point, we see him in the censored version wearing a bear suit, and then when he steps out of the bear suit, we see a big black box with the word censored on it that kind of hovers over him for the rest of the episode. And his name is censored every time you hear it. And I think what Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of South Park, were most offended by is that at the end of the episode, there's sort of a what we learned speech given by Kyle, the South Park kid, and the entire thing is bleeped out. So we don't know what he and several other characters, I believe it's Jesus Christ, Santa Claus, and Kyle, each make a long speech that are bleeped out. So,
and we should say that between the 200th episode and the 201st episode, someone posted what sounds possibly like a threat to the creators of South Park, saying that they will end up like Theo Van Gogh for having blasphemed.
A site called Revolution Islam, I believe, is the name of the site. Started to post some sort of veiled threats to
it was sort of a threat non-threat, where they said this is not a threat, but
it would be
a
hate
warning
to see if something happened to you.
Yeah,
right?
it'd be awful if something happened to you guys. So, and we should clarify what the distinction is about this particular incident. So, Trey Parker and Matt Stone have been making fun of everybody and everything, including the Prophet Muhammad, for years and years now. And in recent years, since Van Gogh's murder and the controversy about portraying images of Muhammad, they themselves have self-censored. They've gotten around the question of, will Comedy Central censor us or not, by censoring themselves, but by contriving to show Muhammad only from inside a U-Haul or a mascot costume or, behind a black censored box. The thing that happened with this 201st episode that's unprecedented is that they submitted a version to the network that they felt was censored enough, and the network, in response to this threat non-threat, then added a further level of censorship. So added bleeps to every time the Prophet Muhammad's name was said, and I think those bleeps at the end to the speeches about freedom of speech, I think, is what they said those speeches were about. So my question is, are you guys upset? Are you upset about the censorship of South Park?
I mean, I don't think there's a simple way in which the 201st episode of South Park is the third or fourth really in a series that begins with Salman Rushdie, goes up through Theo Van Gogh, the Dutch filmmaker who was murdered for doing a documentary film on Muslim women, and then the Danish cartoons, and then South Park. It doesn't seem to me that that's a very simple lineage. And one of the things that complicated that quartet for me was a post by a Comedy Central employee who said, or ex-Comedy Central employee who said, these guys are taking no personal risk here whatsoever, that their supposed courage is not courage in the least. They're actually placing Comedy Central employees who can't afford to live, gated lives at risk. And these guys who've made their, gajillions of dollars off of South Park they simply are not on the front lines of their own supposed courage. And I think there's something to that. I think that these guys their own high-minded convictions about free speech are not in any way forced to stand the test of actual danger.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Comedy Central employee or former employee who posted that, it wasn't necessarily objecting to the airing of the episode in the first place, and that certainly is a question of free speech, but more the attitude of Trey Parker and Matt Stone subsequently, that they were sort of, making a great blow for freedom by being offended by Comedy Central censoring. And I mean, if you think about the fact, for example, I don't know if it's the same building, but your wife works at Viacom, right? I mean, there are thousands of people that go to work in these buildings every day, which if there were an actual Islamist terrorist trying to bomb a building or put anthrax in an envelope or something, it would likely not be able to get to Trey Parker and Matt Stone, right? It would go the way of some building representing South Park.
And also, I should say that, and Julia, I'm interested to hear what you think about this, that South Park is such an equal opportunity offender in a way that it's never been, and I like South Park well enough, but it's never... the angle of its satire has never been especially sharp or targeted or specific in such a way that anything they do feels especially like courage to me in a way. I mean...
Well, I don't know if framing it around courage is quite the right way to think about it. I mean, I'm having trouble thinking through my response to this because on the one hand, I find it hard to take South Park seriously. It's a little hard to put South Park in the same category as Marina Abramovic. She's working under circumstances of incredible oppression, and every act of her art in certain ways was brave at the time. South Park comes out of this culture of utter decadence and utter freedom to say whatever you want, to do whatever you want. And in fact, this show that doesn't really have a particularly interesting point of view on the world has been allowed to flourish for years and years and years. It has a devoted following. It doesn't really have a huge amount of cultural currency. I mean, people... sort of the barbs of satire that are really landing and striking blows on modern American culture feel like they're much more from The Daily Show or The Colbert Report and those branches of the Comedy Central. The South Park MO is fundamentally so silly that it's hard to read serious political commentary out of it, which in a way makes it harder to defend as a serious free speech case. On the other hand, it makes me really uncomfortable to hear you guys saying like, like maybe they should be censored for the protection of the employees of Viacom. Like, once you start crossing these lines of saying, well, okay, even South Park won't depict Muhammad, and even, that Yale University press book about the Danish cartoon controversy decided not to include the Danish cartoons in it because they were concerned about their employees getting bombed or harassed or otherwise hurt. Like, it's a chilling effect. It's
right, then it starts to be the terrorists have won kind of situation.
Yeah,
I see exactly what you mean.
Being able to understand, kind of what this controversy is about. I'm not saying people should glibly, put blasphemous images of Muhammad all over the internet, but in American culture, one should be able to, speak freely about religion. Even if it's Trey Parker and Matt Stone, and I don't really care that much about what they have to say.
Well, in that regard, I mean, I will stand up for South Park, in spite of having just said that I actually do, I guess, given the circumstances, that this horrible thing is happening and that these, crazy religious fanatics are threatening people. I think that Comedy Central probably made a prudent move. And I have to say, if we were to say something on this Gabfest and our executive producer, Andy Bowers, were to say, hey, I think that this could put you or other people at Slate in danger, I would be very happy to have that axed from the Gabfest. So in that respect, I don't necessarily support Parker and Stone. But I do think that the place that South Park occupies in the comedy ecosystem is something that even if I don't watch the show anymore, I do like the show. And I sort of want that spot, that wheelhouse that they occupy to continue to exist. It's sort of an extreme radical libertarian blunt stance of, let's just make fun of everyone and everything. And I think they do it with a skill and a verve and a kind of craft that I respect. I like the fact that Parker and Stone still draw the show, that they still do the voices, that they still believe in it, that it still feels like, a work of craft.
Do we all agree that this is a subject about which we have to agree to be somewhat confused? That it doesn't break down for whatever reason along simple lines of First Amendment martyrdom, versus forces of mindless censorship? That somehow the right that's being upheld implicitly by South Park to say whatever it wants to say, it doesn't feel as though it's entirely on behalf of the First Amendment in some way. That South Park is so about.
Well, in some ways, it's about button pushing, right? It's about the right to be provocative,
yeah.
And so,
which falls under the dominion of free speech.
Sure, that falls under. But I think this is why it feels different from Salman Rushdie and from Theo van Gogh, is that it's, and maybe not from Danish cartoons, which are a little bit more. I mean,
in between. But not fully over to where South Park is. But that, Julia, that's exactly it. It's pressing the button that's hooked up to the TNT and then expressing surprise when it blows up, right? I mean, and furthermore, the courage, the supposed courage, right, being expressed by the creators of South Park is we have the guts to press the button, right, in some weird way, but they're nowhere near the actual explosion, which is what I think this person was trying to get at by saying that these guys are basically being assholes about this.
Well, and it's almost like this isn't the right test case for how American cultural products should deal with the depiction of Muhammad, right? I mean, it kind of goes forward to our next discussion about Kevorkian, about when you're trying to make the case that in American culture, people should have the right to make sport of Muhammad if they have a point to make about something larger than the fact that they have the right to make sport of Muhammad. But because it's so hermetic and it's literally just about being offensive and being provocative, maybe that's why we're all having a little bit of trouble standing behind it as a pure free speech violation.
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly. There's something extrinsic to Salman Rushdie's state of mind. You know, in writing the Satanic Verses, he's not doing it in order to provoke a certain kind of response from the Muslim community. He, in some ways, is acting as a free artist, right, in a free society to create a work of art that's independent of those considerations. And then when there's a reaction, a fatwa placed on his head as a result of it, something about our liberal ideals is endangered, right, and brought into question. Whereas it was absolutely intrinsic to this depiction that response would be the one provoked, right, when the South Park creators did this, and therefore it's deriving energy and the force of publicity and the glamour of danger and of publicity from the response implied in that depiction. And somehow that doesn't, for me, rise to an act of actual First Amendment martyrdom.
That was a beautifully stated distinction, but I think a good First Amendment lawyer would demolish it in a second. And that, you know, the fact that we let Nazis march and so forth, I mean, I think that a political statement by no means has to have any substantive content or, you know, artistic.
Yeah, I think Steve's distinction is less useful as, you know, is this an actual First Amendment case, and more useful as, on an emotional gut level, how am I responding? Why am I so confused about this? Mm-hmm. Why do I not have sort of a pure, unfettered response to it? And I feel like that really nails it.
I do too.
On to our third topic. I have to admit, Julia, that when I started watching and faced with the prospect of watching an HBO issues procedural about Jack Kevorkian and his fight for the right to die with dignity and without pain, I thought I thought they would belabor their way through it. I would belabor my way through it, and it would be a drag all around. I was actually, in a strange way, spellbound by both Pacino's performance and the issues surrounding it. Explain my weakened aesthetic defenses here.
I don't really have a strong aesthetic critique of the movie. I just wasn't that interested in it. It felt to me like a fairly standard biopic, marked mostly by Pacino's really remarkable performance as Kevorkian, but remarkable only in the sense that it's different from other Pacino performances and that it's a little bit more subdued and restrained.
You didn't think he was good as Kevorkian?
I really liked it. I thought he was good, but what was most remarkable about it was how different it was, that he wasn't, you know, shouting like the lawyer and the devil's advocate or just completely over the top. It showed a level of restraint that I feel like we haven't seen from him in a while. And I didn't think it shed a lot of new light on his work.
Dana, do you feel that way?
Well, I quite liked the movie. I think it does fall into a lot of, you know, biopic standard moments, and there's some really disappointing moments in the direction. It was made by Barry Levinson, the director Barry Levinson, who's done some really good work. I mean, no one who made Diner is ever going to be completely absent from my heart. I love that movie, and I think he does a really great job with Al Pacino. He's a good director of actors, but there were some moments that he slipped into some crazy TV cliche, like the flashback where you see the younger actor playing Al Pacino, and I don't know, just some coming down the courthouse steps kind of moments.
And a lot of like bad exposition. Like it seems like all Dr. Kevorkian ever spoke about while lying around at home with his sister or friends is like, let me expositorily explain what's happened in the several months since we last had a assisted suicide.
But doesn't that sort of suit with the portrait of Kevorkian that this movie gives as sort of almost autistically obsessed, right? I mean, he's almost, or OCD, I guess, is the better diagnosis.
I'd be more forgiving of it if the other characters didn't too. Like, there's a lot of like DAs and other lawyers running around who are forever talking to each other and like, well, I don't know what Kevorkian's up to this time, blah 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 blah. You know, I just felt very wooden to me.
Let me make a case for the humanity in its woodenness. I thought that the movie was designed to make you uncomfortable that Kevorkian had that feel for public theater and that deep a feeling for his own martyrdom to a great cause, that his monomania and his megalomania was supposed to make you deeply uncomfortable that this person was carrying forward a cause that is a complex one and may or may not be humane. And in that way, it made the John Brown problem or the Antigone problem that much more heightened. You know, when an individual conscience decides that the law is immoral and they answer to something higher, something, you know, to a higher cause or natural law, and as an agent of change, they do something like, you know, John Brown committing an act of terrorism, Antigone burying her brother, Kevorkian committing an act of homicide.
Trey Parker and Matt Stone showing Mohammed.
Sure. That the moral, for a second, the moral universe goes skew, right? And you really don't know what's right. Like, I'm not even sure that Sophocles knows what's right? I mean, that it's not clear. You know, we're all equal under the law, and Kevorkian did kill someone, right? But he's making an argument. It takes a kind of crazy person to make an argument to posterity, the way these sorts of people do, and they're unpleasant to be around, and they have that whistleblower mentality of slightly narcissistic, you know, maybe verging on a full personality disorder, and yet sometimes the moral universe follows them, and then eventually what they've done is enshrined in law, and humanity changes forever. And this is how Kevorkian saw himself. And so, in a way, to have Pacino underplaying that drama and not sort of letting that Pacino expansiveness fill up in a way that he played against that the grain of the story in a way I thought was remarkable. I thought it was very moving, and I thought it's a movie about bringing us to the boundary of life and death, and it was sincere in that.
Do you think that the movie makers struggle with the question of whether what he's doing is right, or do you think that, grading personality aside, that it's a completely pro-euthanasia film?
I thought it was fairly agnostic on that.
No,
but maybe...
that's why I wasn't that interested in it. I thought if it had really forced us to grapple with some of the actual uncertainties about what he did and how he did it and what one should do, I would have been much more interested in the film. As it was, I felt like, you know, there's one moment where he doesn't have access to an unlimited supply of the drugs that he needs to perform his assisted suicides, so he comes up with kind of a cockamamie, jerry-rigged device to retain some of the fatal gas that he's using so he can reuse it on other patients, and it makes the death of one of the patients he's assisting much more painful and stressful and traumatic than it would be if he had just done it with unlimited
And I thought
supplies.
that scene was great. I thought it was one of the high points of the movie.
I totally agree, but it felt like it was included as like the one token moment of ambiguity, and then he gets a stern talking to from his John Goodman wingman, who's like, you really shouldn't do it if it doesn't feel right. And then ever after in the movie, he walks the straight and narrow, and all his actions are pure, and his cause is noble, and it didn't hold up for me.
Yeah, I guess I had fairly low expectations for it as a cinematic work, and was more interested to see Pacino take on the role. And that, like you guys, I was quite impressed with what he did. I mean, Pacino has had this late career, I mean, really from his mid-career on, right? He's been sort of progressively ramping up the hamminess. But lately, I have this Pacino theory that he's started to ramp it back down again. Like, I saw him as Shylock in that Merchant of Venice movie a couple years ago, walking in thinking, surely this is going to be a campy Scent of a Woman kind of Shylock, and I'll walk out, you know, quoting the catchphrases in the hammy Pacino voice.
Right? I love Shylock.
Pay to see it. Pay to see it. Dana Stevens as Al Pacino as Shylock.
Yeah, with the sort
it
of,
would make the second half of my
with
life.
the sort of old Jew at a deli kind of intonation or whatever. But then to my surprise, the whole movie is pretty good, that Merchant of Venice. But he, as Shylock, is really fantastic and really reins it in. And I thought he did sort of the same in this movie. He does really work on his Michigander accent. I'm not Midwestern enough to know whether he nails it or not, but it sounded really good to me. And I mainly liked that he had an emotional restraint and he's sort of schlubby and not trying to call too much attention to himself. Susan Sarandon's also terrific in a small, extremely unglamorous role. It's very funny to see Susan Sarandon try to frump herself up for this part.
Yeah, and one thing I loved most about the movie, I think, was the set direction and the costuming, which is set in this very specific sort of 80s and early 90s, not particularly moneyed Michigan world. And I thought the details of it were kind of beautiful and interesting.
You're right. The costumes are a study in sort of unassuming ugliness of the late 80s.
They're really great. That was what I loved most about it. Particularly his apartment. His apartment is just completely unappealing to look at, and set designers have such a hard time making unlovely interior spaces. Even for people who are poor or not interested in aesthetics, they always want to make things look nice, and I liked the cold dowdiness of his space.
All right, well, on that note, let's endorse Dana.
Yes, my endorsement for this week is a double endorsement. It's a book and a record that go together. Do you guys know the 33 1/3 book series? Those little monographs.
Well,
on a
we've
single
endorsed it
record?
before because that Carl Wilson,
Right, the Carl Wilson book. Let's Talk About Love that we're always talking about.
Celine Dion. It's like the
book.
mega endorsement. I feel like we've
Yeah,
endorsed
it
it
is.
16 times.
That and the BBC's 100 Objects. We just keep on going back and re-endorsing them again and again. But so my friend Dan Coyce, my frequent partner on Slate Spoiler Special podcasts, wrote one of these books, and he gave it to me a couple months ago. It's been sitting around waiting to be read, and I just read it, and it's really wonderful. So I'm going to recommend both the book, which is called Facing Future, and the album Facing Future that it's named after. The book by Dan Coyce with the 33 1/3 series, and the album by, and here's where I'm really going to go out on a limb and try to pronounce this guy's name, by the Hawaiian pop singer Israel Kamaka Vivo Ole. And he sang this version of, it's a medley of Somewhere Over the Rainbow and What a Wonderful World that you always hear at weddings, in yoga classes, in bar mitzvahs. It's a very beautiful ukulele version of those two songs, and made an international hit with that, but is also a huge, and I didn't know this till I read the book, a huge pop star and sort of national legend in Hawaii. He's dead now. He died in the 90s, but his story is absolutely fascinating. He weighed 1,000 pounds when he died. He was this huge man. He was a drug addict and a food addict and a sort of very lovable, endearing, but very messed up guy. And Dan tells his story really fascinatingly. So the two really feed into each other. The record makes the book better, and the book makes the record better.
I'm so excited to read that. I've been looking forward to it.
Julia, what do you have?
I have a bit of an off-the-cuff endorsement this week. I saw Josh Charles, the actor, who played Knox Overstreet in Dead Poets Society, for those of you who are fans of that movie, just schlumping around to the West Village where our offices are yesterday, kind of looking like he had a cold. He looked a little bit like you with your cold, Steve, and wearing kind of a weird hat and a scarf and just looking like a normal Joe. And seeing him reminded me how much I love the show Sports Night, which was the show Aaron Sorkin did before he did The West Wing. It only lasted for 2 seasons. It was about basically behind the scenes at Sports Center was the concept, sort of a revolutionary sports show that was kind of remaking the sports news idiom. And it had Felicity Huffman as a harried producer, and Josh Charles was one of the 2 anchors, and he was fantastic in it. And Sorkin's one of those TV auteurs who's gone a little bit off the reservation, and that Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip wasn't that good. It's unclear what his next show will be. Apparently he's working on a show behind the scenes at an Oberman-esque TV production, so maybe that'll be good. But if you're tiding yourself over for good Sorkin, you can go back and revisit Sports Center. And it's only 2 seasons, so it's one of those.
Night.
So if you're tiding yourself over for the next good Sorkin production, you can go back and catch up on Sports Night. And it's also only 2 seasons, so you can get hooked and not find yourself wasting months and months of your life.
Terrific, thank you. My endorsement this week ties in a little bit with yours. If at the root, at the origin, the source for all of the fast-talking, high-wit television that we now love is the best screwball comedy of all time, which is Dana called
His Girl Friday? I guessed it.
Lovely.
Even I could have gotten that
Beautifully
right.
done.
No, it could have been
Philadelphia Story,
Bringing Up
Baby. But, I tell you, the thing is, I wouldn't have thought in a million years I needed to endorse this, but a very good friend of mine who's, very much, kind of a lit guy, movie guy, had never seen it. And he was like, oh, which one is that? And he couldn't really, I don't know. And he just didn't, Howard Hawks, directed by Howard Hawks. I think Ben Hecht wrote the screenplay. It's based on The Front Page, which Ben Hecht wrote, but and Rosalind Russell and Cary Grant. It is. I have to say, if I have to take one movie with me into the chamber with Dr. Kevorkian, it's going to be His Girl Friday. It's just a flawless movie from beginning to end. And anyone who writes rapid fire, funny dialogue owes an eternal debt to it.
And anyone who ever wears a fantastic suit with an ostentatious collar owes an eternal debt to the costumes Rosalind Russell wears in that movie. Mm-hmm. They are fantastic as well. Since I'm on the costume beat today.
Well, and anyone who storms into a newsroom barking out orders, as Julia does, no doubt, every day, owes a huge debt to His girlfriend.
Every day.
Anyways, it's a hit on the happy gas from beginning to end. It's just one of the great American movies of all time. Julia, before we go, a little bit of housekeeping.
So we're very excited to report that our first ever live Gabfest, which is going to be happening May 17th in New York City at Housing Works Bookstore, is sold out. So we're so excited that you guys are excited to come see this experiment unfold in person. We're working out what the subjects for the live show are going to be. Probably a few of them will be topical and news-based, as our subjects usually are. But we're thinking of doing another book, of choosing a book, all reading it in advance, and discussing it as one of the segments. So we would love your recommendations for books that we should discuss on the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/culturefest. A couple of the things that we've considered discussing are perhaps the Stieg Larsson books, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, etc., the popularity of that entire trilogy. The Ask by Sam Lipsett, which is a very funny new book that's out that I haven't read yet, but that's been getting great reviews. Or perhaps The Lost Books of the Odyssey, which is that kind of riff on the Odyssey and the Iliad that I endorsed last week. And we're also open to many other suggestions. So tell us if any of those strike your fancy. Tell us if there's something else you'd like us to read. We're very excited to see what you'd like to discuss. Also, we're going to have a drinking game, a live Gabfest drinking game, which even if you don't get to come to the show, you're welcome to participate at home and just get sozzled as you listen doing your laundry or whatever it is that you're doing while you listen to us.
Except driving.
Except driving, yes. In driving, it can be a lemonade drinking game. Jesse Baker, our lovely producer, is going to put this together for us so that we don't know what the keywords are so that we can't intentionally get you sozzled. So please email your ideas for the catchphrases and buzz phrases that should be drinking cues for the live Gabfest drinking game to slatejb@gmail.com. That's JB for the lovely Jesse Baker, in case you didn't get it. slatejb@gmail.com, drinking game ideas. Thanks so much.
Dana, thank you.
Stephen?
Julia, a pleasure.
Thanks.
You'll find links to some of the things we talked about today at our show page, slate.com/culturefest, and you can email us at culturefest@slate.com or drop us a note at our Facebook page, facebook.com/culturefest. Our producer is Jesse Baker. Jesse, congratulations. You're getting married this week, next week?
Saturday.
And what are you marrying again?
A Falcon Flick.
That's what I thought. The executive producer of Slate Podcasts is Andy Bowers. For Dana Stevens and Julia Turner, I'm Stephen Metcalf. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you soon.
Ooh, somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, and the dreams that